So yeah, sorry,
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
not there. I did get my badge, but unfortunately I got sick, and now I'm 10 minutes walk from the venue, but unfortunately not there. But luckily, technology is giving us a partial solution for me to still join and share my talk. Just briefly about my background, I'm a sociologist, but also a medical anthropologist. I'm also part of the organizing committee. It's been a long journey to get this point, so indeed a bummer that I'm not there live, but I do want to thank all my co-organizers. I'm representing Emerging Technologies Lab from Tampere University. I'm also part of different NGOs and currently a clinical site coordinator of the clinical study going on in Finland, looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for alcohol use disorder. I wanted to start by this little quote that I found from a documentary. So that in 1957, there was a presentation given at the anniversary celebration of University of Turku about the basic problems of psychobiology, where Sarnio says that especially lysergic acid and mescaline have aroused the interest of researchers, especially because of the disorders caused by these substances resemble the symptoms of schizophrenia. So it's very nice to hear Erica's talk about the history, and I kind of wanted to highlight these different concepts that have been used to describe psychedelics and related substances. She mentioned psychotomimetic, and also hallucinogen is something that's still used in medical literature sometimes. Of course, there's psychedelic, and then entheogen, which is more the spiritual use or ceremonial use of psychedelics. And nowadays, there's also these concepts, psycho and neuroplastogen, which is sort of targeting the same receptors as classical psychedelics, but kind of without the trip. So these kind of, I guess, resemble or describe different kinds of understandings of what psychedelics are. And I'm going to bring another one, which is looking at psychedelics as technologies. And it was kind of interesting to hear the etymology of conference. And when I was preparing this talk, I was looking at the etymology of technology, and it actually kind of comes from, as these words usually come from, Greek language, where the techno or technic part means craft or art. So sometimes technologies and technique has been used interchangeably. And then, of course, logi, the study of or knowledge. So technology as a word kind of implies more than simply a piece of hardware. It's more of a practical application of knowledge. And I'm going to kind of go through how I kind of see this related to psychedelics. Looking at psychedelics as technologies is not necessarily a novel idea. There's this quite famous quote by Stan Grof that was also mentioned, where he writes that psychedelics used responsibly and with proper caution would be for psychiatry what the microscope is to the study of biology and medicine, or the telescope for astronomy. So even in this kind of quote, you can kind of see that psychedelics are looked by Stan Grof as a sort of a technology that allows us to see beyond what our kind of natural vision allows us to see. Maybe when the microscope is looking at the world of very small and the telescope the world of very large, psychedelics are able us to see the world inside in a way. It's not the only kind of reference to psychedelics as technologies or tools. Hoffman, in his preface to that book by Stan, also writes, there are tools which are gauging on our perception toward other deeper areas of our human existence, so that we again become aware of our spiritual essence. Dennis McKenna wrote in an article for Symposia in 2017 that psychedelics are learning tools, and it's urgent that we learn to use them properly. And technology studies background, Swaj Lash has written that from northern scientific labs to southern shamanistic rituals, psychedelics tend to appear as psycho-spiritual social technologies and much more. And these are not the only examples. There's quite more of them, of course. Dubois, in his article in 2021, also speaks of psychedelics as tools for belief. Or in his book, which I have to admit I have not read yet, talks about reality switch technologies. And there was a qualitative study came out this year from Australia, where they interviewed Australian people in the kind of psychedelic fields, clinical researchers and neuroscientists. And from that kind of qualitative interviews, they frame these discussions, or how people kind of frame psychedelics as transformative agents of change and investigative neurotechnology. So there's not an original or new kind of idea, but I want to kind of go through what this kind of can bring to our kind of understanding and how we can look at psychedelics. Quite telling, I think, was that this paper from Yaden and et al. In 2021, where they were kind of being critical about the current hype around psychedelics, used this hype cycle that is used for kind of other technologies developed by Gardner Inc. And they kind of see this as providing an illustration of what we might reasonably forecast about public perception of psychedelics. And in the beginning, there's a technology trigger that then is kind of inflated by different expectations. Where we are in this kind of hype cycle, as they kind of put, is, I think, a matter of a debate in a way. But they kind of want to see us going from seeing psychedelics as magical cures or substances causing only madness to some sort of middle ground. And they see that researchers have a responsibility of deflating this bubble that we are entering or already are in. Of course, psychedelic history is full of different milestones, and I think kind of where we see this technology trigger starting is also a matter of debate. I think Erica also pointed out that the history is complex, and in one way you can think that the technology trigger has been when these substances have been originally extracted or synthesized, but there are of course other milestones as well. And I know that Yaden et al. Didn't really necessarily think about their hype cycle this way, but it just kind of nicely fitted this little graph of looking at LSD and psilocybin studies that have been published over the years. It just kind of nicely fitted, so I just wanted to put it there. So in a way, the technology trigger was already in the 1940s and 50s, or even beyond that. Of course, as mentioned, mescaline was already isolated in 1898, and before that, there was a lot of research about peyote in San Pedro. So where we are in this hype cycle, I think it's in a way indeed a matter of discussion, especially as the amount of research papers on psychedelics in general has indeed now kind of surpassed the amount that has been published in the, whether it's the first wave or second wave of psychedelic research in the 1960s and 70s. So in a way, we're in the third wave, I guess. So just to give kind of a few examples of different kind of potential study approaches of looking at psychedelics as technologies, there's this idea of non-human actors by Bruno Latour, who passed away a few years ago, and kind of based on his work, this actor network theory, which could be used as looking at different actors and looking at psychedelics as part of being those actors, although non-human or other than human network. I think the graph that Erica showed about how global history and how psychedelics have kind of traveled around the world kind of fits that quite well. There's a long history of anthropology of pharmaceuticals. It could also be useful. It was especially developed at the University of Amsterdam, and there's a long history of kind of looking at indeed different pharmaceutical entities as kind of things with social lives, like looking at the very kind of materiality, or they're kind of as looking at them as commodities in a way, and that could be also a fruitful way of looking at these. There's a literature around the sociology of expectations in science and technology that could also be a useful approach. And Eric also mentioned Foucault and his kind of concept of technologies of self, which there's a little quote from him. And I haven't read the book about Foucault's LSD trip in Death Valley, California. There's a book called The Last Man Takes LSD, Michel Foucault, and The End of Revolution by Mitchell Dean and his colleague, but I have not read that, but it's on my Christmas wish list. So hopefully I'll get that and have a chance to look at how it's described. I mean, I think there's claims that his ideas changed after this experience that he had, allegedly. And also we could look at just kind of this health technology assessments, which there are plenty of European Medicine Agency guidelines, for instance. If we look at psychedelics as technologies and make these kinds of assessments, maybe this is more for the kind of post-approval phase, or maybe already now, but we could also kind of research psychedelics as these kinds of health technologies. I also kind of want to look at not just psychedelics as technologies, but kind of psychedelic associated technologies, or as I kind of put here, PAT 3.0. It's not necessarily a concept that I want to develop that much further, to not to mix it with psychedelic assisted therapy, which is also referred to as PAT, but kind of to think about what are technologies associated with the substances. And of course, there are nowadays more and more different formulations. It's not just LSD and psilocybin anymore, or DMT and mescaline. It's also 1P LSD. It's deschloroketamine, which of course is more in the dissociative range. But there's also different forms of synthesizing these substances and extracting them from natural plants. And there's a sort of a competition for patents as well in this realm, which needs, I think, more attention. There's an organization called Porta Sofia, which is trying to kind of, when people are making claims on patents, to kind of show that this has been already in the public domain. So there's also very kind of this development in this space as well. There's also, of course, different neuroimaging and other methods of investigation, which is kind of new in a way compared to the first or second wave of psychedelic research. And these are also kind of, in a way, bringing new understandings of what psychedelics do in the brain, and in that way also what they do for altered states of consciousness and what we understand as consciousness. They're maybe raising more questions than giving answers at this point, because these are very different technologies, which also require different kinds of mathematical work and coding and those kinds of technologies that goes into neuroimaging and these kinds of methods of investigation. Then, of course, there's also this kind of whole emerging political economy coming space. There's a nice kind of color mapping by Alexander Plesner, showing some of the companies and organizations in the space. For some reason, the yellow and the kind of light green colors are not used in the logos of these different organizations, but this is also kind of different than it was even 10 years ago. It's more and more actors in the space making different kinds of networks. And of course, there's different digital environments where these actors also operate. And there's nowadays more and more different kinds of other novel technologies, from virtual reality to artificial reality to AI. And this kind of idea of cyberdelics, which emerged in the 80s and 90s, are kind of coalescing with these technologies. So it's another kind of area of that is kind of very interesting to look at as well. Now, if we look at psychedelic use itself, there's a kind of framework of drugs as instruments developed by Miller and Schumann already in 2011. this idea of non-problematic drug use, which to some large extent I'd say is maturity of drug use. But of course, this is not to say that there isn't challenges in this kinds of views as well, but it's kind of also kind of fits well in this kind of framework of looking at drugs as technologies. It's something that people use in outside of clinical environments increasingly. And to kind of just a few technical factors I wanted to list of what we should look at when we look at psychedelics as technologies. Well, of course, what is the specific technology that we're looking at? Is it LSD? Is it psilocybin? Is it DMT? Is it mescaline? Is it other novel substances? And what does it actually do? And this is also depending, of course, on the route of administration. And nowadays there's these studies of IV DMT, extended IV exposure to DMT, which is a kind of a novel route of administration in a way. But also you could argue that the ketamine by Johnson & Johnson, the Spravato, which is the nasal spray, is also a kind of novel route of administration, which has an impact on, of course, what the effects will be of these technologies. Pharmacodynamics and pharmacogenetics. I mean, I'm a sociologist, so there's not much I can say about these, but of course they are very important of looking at what does the technology do to your physiology, and then what the physiology does to the actual technology as well. Dosing is key in many ways, and of course microdosing is something that has emerged in the past decade as a kind of a novel use practice, although there was, of course, a few studies of low-dose psychedelics in the 50s and 60s already, as Torsten Possi explains in his book, The Science of Microdosing. But, of course, dosing in the use of these technologies is very important. And there are other extra-pharmacological variables we know about set and setting. Harjavson has a nice paper on how that emerged as a concept, and I kind of want to introduce another extra-pharmacological variable, which is something I call politicogenic drug effects, and this refers to effects caused by political activity in the drug policing field in general. Similar way to iatrogenic effects, which refer to ill effects caused by medical activity. So basically, I listed a few of these effects that I kind of think as politicogenic drug effects, to give an example of it. So, for instance, loss of civil liberties to the criminalization of these substances, denied access to health and social services, and of course, lack of control, quality control of these products, which then lead to unnecessary health risks and not lethal, but overdose situations still. And a militarized law enforcement are just some of these kind of examples. And of course, there are many more. I kind of wanted to also highlight a few of the more recent discussions in the psychedelic field about looking at the impact of neoliberal capitalism, technocracy, for-profit industry that's emerging, but also psychedelic exceptionalism and different kinds of drug policy reform movements that are ongoing also in Europe and North America at least, and probably other parts of the world as well. And we could look at these as also kind of looking at the effects that go beyond pharmacology. And I mean, we have this conference is about psychedelics and what they are, but it's good to acknowledge, of course, that even in the category of psychedelics, there are the kind of already established psychoactive substances, the classics, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, but there are the active substances, the neoclassics, I guess, in a way, that are emerging. And of course, there's little human research about them, but they are still there. And and people are using them. So we should, of course, have a look of what they do in the real world. And of course, related and pathogens and dissociatives all are of course interesting as well. But there's a whole lot of substances nowadays. It's not just the classical ones anymore. You can find this drug wheel also in Finnish at drugswheel.com. This was my short presentation from using technology to present it to you, and I'm very happy to hear any questions or suggestions of how to kind of develop these ideas. And I forgot to mention in the beginning that the Opti project, as you can see in the slide, is a picture of the internet, which kind of shows how interconnected that world also is. So thank you very much.
Okay, I have a question in two parts. First is just terminology. You used some kind of delic term to describe AI and virtual reality. What was that?
Cyberdelic.
Okay, so now my question is about these terms, cyberdelic and this politicogenic. I mean, do you have a plan or a idea of why to like delicize these? Because I was thinking about you could just talk about political effects to the psychedelic culture, or like I don't know why you'd have to connect virtual reality and of course there's this obvious connection, but what are you working on here?
Cyberdelic is not my term. I think it's developed already in the 80s and 90s, and it's been, I guess, proliferating kind of through that. Politicogenic, I mean, that's kind of what I developed in my PhD in a related article, was kind of just to emphasize the different effects that drugs in general have that are not based on their pharmacology. You could, of course, in a very simple way, just talk about political effects, but I thought it was kind of just kind of a way of emphasizing that there are indeed these extra-pharmacological effects that go beyond just the chemistry of them.
Thank you for your presentation. I wondered if you could extend the political context to also recognizing the impact of the internet itself as a way of capturing the information that we can use to measure these effects. And I noticed a few of your charts. I think, historically there are pieces of evidence that don't get captured in some of the digital materials that we use to give rise to that technology graph, for example, or the distribution of publications. There are lots of underground publications that existed outside of that political framework that don't appear on the internet, so they don't get captured in this graph as evidence. And I wonder if, therefore, the digital technology itself is a limiting factor in measuring the political context.
Definitely, I agree that it is kind of limited in the scope of it, because it's only can capture what's online, and of course there's a lot online still. So we do also kind of need to of capturing that and what it means. There's all these kind of big data approaches, but I think as a more of a qualitative researcher, that the devil's in the details. So like we can capture chunks of digital data and it tells us something, but we need to kind of zoom in what's there and what isn't there as well, to kind of acknowledge the limitations that it does only provide a view of what's the digital part of these discussions. I mean, in my PhD, I looked at how microdosing developed on YouTube and how that kind of knowledge was formed and shared on this from 2016 until 2019. So made these kind of data scrapes a few years, but that also doesn't necessarily say anything about it beyond that. It just kind of gives a glimpse of what's the kind of development in that particular digital environment.
You mentioned the psychedelic exceptionalism. I was wondering what's your take on it. Sort of, I'm not sure whether everyone's familiar with the idea, but what's your take on it? How that will maybe develop over the 5 or 10 years following the discussion, and whether there are some risks or benefits for that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I'm only familiar that Carl Hart, the professor of psychology from Columbia University, was providing this example at the Horizon conference a few years back, where I mean, the term kind of refers to that we look at psychedelics as the good drugs and then other substances as the bad drugs. And as a more kind of general drug policy activist, I think that is not a fruitful way to think of these things, because I mean, all of them have been marginalized and all of their users have been marginalized. So if we kind of also inside this field start making these kinds of like us and them categorizations and divisions, it's not the way to go. How to kind of correct that, I think it's just kind of acknowledging that there is perhaps this kind of thing in this field, but to how to kind of fix that and how it will develop, we'll see. I just probably just having these discussions and remembering that there are other types of substances and their users that are not in any way worse than psychedelic users.
So, thank you, Aleksi. And
Thank you, and have a great conference. Too bad I'm not able to be there in person.